the game changer. This is EPA-FAKE-CERCLA-Part 7. It's always been about motives versus motivation. A little over 5 years ago, the Mills Gap Road Concerned Citizens for Cleanup formed a community advisory group to protect and promote the health of our residents, protect and promote the health of our environment. Over the last 15 years, approximately 50 cases of non-Hodgkin lymphoma have been diagnosed within 1 mile of the CTS site. Our agenda, our motivation, has been for a complete cleanup, led by the EPA removal branch, to be paid for by CTS Corporation. In conjunction with that, we've always worked for city water lines, proper air assessments to make sure the air that people are breathing is safe. And we've also pushed relentlessly for the accountability for those agents who may have broken serious laws in their efforts to conceal what really happened at 235 Mills Gap Road in Asheville, North Carolina. And for EPA Region 4, it comes down to what did you know and when did you know it? And now we can answer that. On December 22nd, 2011, the North Carolina General Assembly announced that Representative Tim Moffitt's House Select Committee investigating the handling of the CTS disaster was to meet. The date was set for January 17th, 2012. The agenda for the meeting is expected to include presentations from the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, the United States Environmental Protection Agency, and a local expert on the site, including information on the contamination present, the site's history, and the current status of remediation. As you could probably predict, the United States Environmental Protection Agency failed to send representatives from Region 4. The agenda for January 17, 2012 was simple and straightforward. It called for Representative Tim Moffitt to call the hearings to order with introductory remarks, introduction of committee members and their staff, a review of the committee charge, the adoption of the budget, and then CTS Corporation site information, history, contamination present, and the current status of remediation, oversight by the U.S. EPA, and activities of NC Diener, presented by Dexter Matthews, Director of the Division of Waste Management. Mr. Matthews would end up presenting information on behalf of U.S. EPA as they failed to show up. Next was site information from a local perspective, summary findings of the Citizens Monitoring Council, to be given by Tate McQueen, Citizens Monitoring Group and Community Advisory Group, South Asheville, Buncombe County, North Carolina. In the lead up to the hearings, the committee was informed that in order to provide the best and most detailed history of the site and the way it has been handled, the committee members were informed that it might take between 2.5 and 3 hours. The committee called one witness from Asheville. That was Tate McQueen. That was followed by commission discussion and announcements. The commission allowed for residents who had traveled from Asheville and supported the CHE to comment for 3 minutes per person, and no one could have predicted the fallout that came from the hearings. At the time of the hearings, the CAG did not have the missing administrative record that David Dorian had removed from the public library in June of 2007. Much of what was covered had been provided in meetings at the Skyline Fire Department. There was not much new that the folks from Asheville did not know already. However, what we learned from Dexter Matthews was priceless. The first slide of Mr. Matthews' presentation had a photograph that was predictable, showing CTS from straight on in the middle of the summer, concealing just how close the houses were to the CTS facility. In fact, they were built on top of the CTS disaster site. The real revelations came shortly thereafter. The second slide was a breakdown of Diener's Division of Waste Management sections and one program: hazardous waste, solid waste, underground storage tank, superfund, and the brownfield program. Slide 3 was the superfund section for the state of North Carolina that CTS of Asheville fits in. NC Diener placed the CTS site in its inactive hazardous sites branch inventory in 1993. The fourth slide dealt with the EPA's criteria First, the National Priority List or NPL site criteria, using a score of 28.5 or higher, and they acknowledge that there are 37 NPL sites being cleaned up in the state of North Carolina, 3 of them in Buncombe County alone. We'll talk more about the NPL process as it relates to CTS later. Next up was the removal action criteria. Removal imminent threat to human health and the environment at sites that require emergency action or that have a contaminant release that exceed removal action levels. Average of 8 EPA removal actions per year in North Carolina. We'll talk more about removal actions as they pertain to the CTS of Asheville site, or the lack thereof, from Region 4 and Region 4's officials. Slide 5, Inactive Hazardous Sites Branch. The State Inactive Hazardous Sites Branch addresses sites that do not meet federal criteria for NPL listing or EPA removal action. Currently, there are 1,916 open sites in the Inactive Hazardous Sites Branch inventory. There are 319 ongoing assessments or cleanups, including priority sites and registered environmental consultant program sites. The key question here is, why didn't the state do more while EPA was doing nothing? We will certainly get into that a little later. As we move forward, we're going to point out the inaccuracies. We'll tell you what they got right. We'll definitely show you what they got wrong. Remember, Mr. Matthews is presenting on behalf of EPA officials who refused to participate. Matthews states, the facility was open from 1953 to 1985. Started in 53 under IRC. In 1959, CTS took over. They operated it until 1987, not 1985. And yes, electroplating of electronic components was the staple for the factory. The site was originally 66 acres. In the 1970s, about 9 acres came off for a county reservoir. In 1986, a little over 3 acres came off the top of the ridgeline that was later developed into the treetops. That left 53.54 acres. Of that, inexplicably, 44.89 acres was subdivided in 1997. 37 of that was developed into the actual Southside Village subdivision. Matthews stated that trichloroethylene in groundwater has impacted 7 residential water supplies. 7. Only 7 impacted residential water supplies? I don't think so. The documents show that Terry Rice's water was impacted by TCE. His brother Larry Jr., his water impacted by TCE. Dot and Larry Rice, their water impacted by TCE. Across the street, the Robinsons. The well was there. That's Becky and Mac's house. There's Mac's mother's house. She died of pancreatic and liver cancer. Go down to the Oak subdivision. This whole neighborhood was removed from groundwater in 2008 because all these houses and their water supplies were impacted by TCE. That's 34% of the homes in that neighborhood. And then when we come back to 2009, there's David Bradley's house. They were drinking 1,400 parts per billion of TCE. It is utterly inaccurate to suggest that only 7 water supplies were impacted by TCE. Mr. Matthews states with slide 7 that the CTS site has been addressed primarily under the control of US EPA and that there has been concurrent work done by Division of Waste Management since 2007. That simply is not the case. NC Diener would have us believe that after August 1999 that they had nothing to do with this site until 2007. That simply is not the case. In 2001, Harry Zinn, environmental engineer for the state Superfund section, sent Jennifer Wendell, North Carolina Site Management Section Chief for EPA, his expanded site inspection scoring. Mr. Zinn, in a phone call in the summer of 2008, stated he did not understand why there were 3 separate CERCLA numbers for the same source of contamination. He stated that he had always used the NCD number, the one that belonged to CTS of Asheville. How could Diener make the claim that they hadn't participated on that site from 1999 until 2007? This is Harry Zinn's expanded site inspection report. It says this report was based on data collected by Tetra Tech, a U.S. EPA START contractor, and the North Carolina Superfund section. Mr. Zinn may have been uncomfortable using any other number than the CTS of Asheville designation, but he did not mind to commingle data from the Mills Gap site, which is exactly where Barbara Caprita's work came from in that 1999 EPA START contract. Here's the cover to that report. This was Barbara Caprita's report that Harry Zinn of NC Diener largely based his conclusions in his expanded site inspection for the CTS of Asheville site, using data collected under the Mills Gap site. Mr. Zinn recommended a NIFRAP disposition or no further remedial action planned, again for CTS of Asheville. This is a memo from June 26, 2006 from Harry Zinn, Environmental Engineer, Diener Superfund. Telephone message from Dave Andrews, EPA On-Scene Coordinator. Mills Gap Road groundwater contamination site. Harry went ahead and put the NCD 003149556 number. Well, that can't be the number for the Mills Gap Road groundwater contamination site, because that number is SFN 0406988. It appears that Mr. Zinn was working two sites for the same source of contamination. The Mills Gap Road groundwater contamination site, SFN 0406988. The CTS of Asheville site, NCD 003149556. Mr. Zinn filed that memo in June of 2006. He had CTS's number assigned to the Mills Gap Road groundwater contamination site name. In forthcoming documentaries, we will show the inherent conflict with NC Diener, Division of Waste Management, and EPA Region 4. The first bullet talks about EPA being involved in identifying threat to off-site drinking water sources and providing alternative water to impacted residents. This work also supports MPL listing requirements. Earlier in this documentary, we saw the aerials showing just how many homes had been impacted by contaminated drinking water. Nowhere in this report does it talk about the entire subdivision known as the Oaks being removed from their groundwater source and placed on city water. Nowhere does it say anything about David Bradley's well on Chapel Hill Church Road and the fact that they had a 10-year-old child living in that house and the test results came back at 1,400 parts per billion TCE. One of the concerns the community had was that every time a home was removed from its groundwater source, it was also removed from the NPL scoring process, which may have delayed an NPL designation from happening sooner and with a more accurate score. The next bullet states that EPA has also operated a soil vapor extraction system to reduce levels of contaminants in an adjacent spring. What it doesn't say is that EPA admitted that that system failed in January of 2010 during a meeting that was called for by Senator Richard Burr. In attendance was Congressman Schuler, Senator Hagan's point person, Freddie Harrell, and also members of NC Diener's staff, including Bruce Parris and Bonnie Ware. The site's 7th on-scene coordinator for EPA Region 4 under the removal branch, Stephen Ball, presented, and he was under the watchful eye of Mr. Don Rigger, along with Brian Myers, attorney for EPA Region 4. Everyone in the room heard detailed information that the soil vapor extraction system failed to yield any diminishing returns on the levels of contaminant in the Rice's Springs. They concluded that the soil vapor extraction system had failed. This was January 2010. This was all part of allowing CTS Corporation the cheapest, most ineffective way of handling their disaster site. This is all part of the underlying issue that we face. The site has been seemingly intentionally mismanaged to the benefit of CTS Corporation and to the detriment of our community. The SVE system was not even designed for the type of soil composition found at the CTS of Asheville site. It is designed for semi-porous, non-clay soils, which you don't find at the CTS site. Sometime between June and July 2010, copper thieves dismantled and rendered the SVE system inoperable. The system no longer worked, and since then, our community has seen absolutely no removal actions underway to address the source of contamination that continues to enter our groundwater system, continues to express itself through our springs, our surface water, and in our air. Slide 8 is where Mr. Matthews begins to provide NC Diener's version of the CTS site history. Mr. Matthews states the International Resistor Company had the plant from 1952 to 1959. It actually went operational in 1953. In 1959, CTS Corporation merged with IRC. They ran the facility from 1959 till about 1986, early 1987. During the transition, when the building and the property was sold, former employees operated Arden electroplating in the facility with a lease purchase for the equipment and a lease on the plating room. This is where the testimony gets truly interesting. Mr. Matthews described the EPA preliminary assessment as being conducted on October 30th, 1985. The report finds no threat to human health or the environment, but recommends follow-up site survey. That was, according to EPA and NC Diener, EPA's first attempt at scoring the site for the national priority list. If you had been in the room, you would have heard Mr. Matthews detail how EPA used state officials for that EPA preliminary assessment. Again, we've talked about this in prior documentaries, but let's revisit exactly what went down on October 30th, 1985. Keep in mind, EPA was conducting the preliminary assessment because of concerns over the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act violations at the site. For a more thorough look into what happened October 30th, 1985 and that report, please visit youtube.com, search EPA-FAKE-CERCLA-Part 5. The state of North Carolina's Mark DeRay did this preliminary assessment. He took the word of the hazardous waste coordinator Norman Lewis. EPA says this was their first attempt to score the site for the NPL. How could this be possible considering that Mr. DeRay never left Raleigh? And yet Mr. DeRay rendered a low priority assessment for the site. DeRay based it on his conversation with Norman Lewis, the hazardous waste coordinator for CTS. Never bothered to verify the information. Norman Lewis had claimed that no one lived within 5 football fields of the facility, yet he and his mother lived across a street within 125 yards of the plant. Norman Lewis also claimed that residents used city water and that there were no known wells near the CTS plant. While there were 397 wells located within 3 miles of the CTS plant, the Robinsons' well was within 1,200 feet, and the Rices were getting their drinking water supply from the springs, which were located next door to the CTS plant. This all leaves our community wondering, in the worst-case what-if scenario, what if Mark DeRay had verified what he was being told? Would he have still reached a low-priority assignment for this site? That may have been the way things were done back then, but it failed our community, and it left us exposed for far longer than anyone should have ever been. Mr. DeRay did recommend that when EPA got around to it, maybe they could do a reconnaissance survey on the CTS of Asheville site. Next for Mr. Matthews was talking about the August 1987 private site assessment conducted by Law Environmental, requested by CTS Corporation as a pre-sale screening for their property to determine if there were any contaminants located at the CTS of Asheville site. Please note that the report from October 1985 found no threat to human health or the environment. It did recommend a follow-up site survey. And then we have a private site survey conducted in 1987 by Law Environmental. When CTS Corporation put the CTS of Asheville site up for sale, Marvin Goebel certified that the site was clean and free from any hazardous materials. He provided this statement to the listing agent with Caldwell banker, Mr. Stan Greenberg. Mr. Goebel stated that CTS believed that the site was in clean condition environmentally. He said, to the best of CTS's knowledge, no on-site disposal or otherwise wanton disposal methods were practiced at this facility. And we know that's not true. The site was listed in January 1987. The site sat on the market for 6 months. The listing agent Stan Greenberg and a consortium of local developers made an offer to purchase in June of 1987 for $540,000. A warranty clause was added to the offer to purchase, stating that the site was clean and that there'd be a private environmental audit, and that if it wasn't clean, the purchasers had the right to opt out of the contract. CTS Corporation chose Law Environmental out of Kennesaw, Georgia, to do the site assessment in June, July, and into August of 1987. The results were sent to Marvin Goebel's CTS Corporation. It is highly likely that Marvin Goebel submitted information as a background for Law Environmental before they began their sampling and their investigation. No known spills or releases have occurred at the site, and no violations of environmental regulations have been issued for the facility. Nothing could be further from the truth. The preceding information was provided to us by CTS personnel during our initial site visit. Law Environmental's findings certainly contradicted claims made by CTS. The highest hit for TCE came in at a whopping 53,000 parts per billion. There were other samples that included 4,000 parts per billion, with other contaminants like Xylenes, toluene, dichloroethylene, perchloroethylene, cyanide, chromium, you name it. If it was involved in the plating business, they found it. This is the sample summary for PA4CV, which indicated trichloroethylene at 53,000 parts per billion. It wasn't just trichloroethylene, it was a whole plethora of contaminants. Here's one that shows ethyl benzene at 53,000 parts per billion and the total xylenes at 280,000 parts per billion. Those are massive numbers. In the results section of Law Environmental's report, they noted that TCE had been found in all boring samples. The highest levels of TCE found in the hand auger samples were at HAC1. TCE was being found in every sample they took. Law Environmental stated that elevated levels of volatile organic constituents were detected in the plating area and in the paint curing area, and the primary constituents were trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene, also known as tetrachloroethylene, in the plating room. Remember this statement? No known spills or releases have occurred at the site, and no violations of environmental regulations have been issued for the facility. That statement just doesn't mesh with Law Environmental's findings. The suspected source of volatile constituent contamination is from spills or leaks in the plating area and in the paint curing area. So if CTS didn't know, they certainly did after that Law Environmental report. So what were Law Environmental's recommendations for CTS? Law Environmental stated the presence of hazardous constituents at the site has been confirmed, and it was Law Environmental's recommendation that even though they considered the threat to groundwater to be minimal, that groundwater monitoring wells be installed, 4 or 5, to ascertain the direction of groundwater flow and to get samples. It was recommended by Law Environmental as a verification step in the assessment process in terms of calculating whether the site was a risk or not. CTS opted not to follow Law Environmental's recommendations. Now, are you ready for the other shoe to drop? Here is the other motive, gift-wrapped. Comes from Dexter Matthews' bombshell. It came from his testimony in Raleigh last year. Mr. Matthews detailed how the site was sold officially December 23, 1987 for $540,000, 54-acre parcel to Mills Gap Road Associates. He briefly discussed the fact that Division of Waste Management created the Inactive Hazardous Sites branch, and then we get to the big one. What happened on June 18, 1990? This is where it all comes full circle. Dexter Matthews stated that on June 18, 1990, Division of Waste Management received residents' concerns of contamination at CTS and potential drinking water well impacts. This is where it all comes together. On June 18, 1990, Pat DeRosa, who was the CERCLA branch superfund chief for North Carolina, had a memo detailing a conversation she had with Miss Robin Purcell, Hazardous Waste Section, detailing CTS Corporation and concerns from a resident. DeRosa detailed the call that Miss Purcell had received from Dave Ogren of Ogren Industries. Mr. Ogren lives in the area. Mr. Ogren was concerned about an old chemical pond which used to be at the CTS property. He said that the property was about to be sold or had just been sold, and he was concerned that the contaminated areas on site might not be cleaned up. He also said that a well had recently been installed on the adjacent residential property. This property is owned by Larry Rice. Dave Ogren said that after the well was put into use, the owners began having health problems. He said that the well was contaminated. Let me repeat. Dave Ogren said that after the well was put into use, the owners began having health problems. He said that the well was contaminated.
He also talked about contamination on the CTS property. This is June 18th, 1990. And why is that significant? You will understand the significance. Perhaps it was because Ms. Purcell also spoke to Dennis Lance, Buncombe County Metropolitan Sewer District, that maybe it didn't get quite the attention it deserved. Mr. Lance was apparently familiar with the CTS facility in that he conducted sampling of the pre-treated wastewater from CTS when it was in operation. And why would he be doing that? And just who is Dennis Lance? Well, Dennis Lance of the Metropolitan Sewer District was a former CTS employee. The state did not do any follow-up investigation. They took the word of a former employee, but they did do something very important. According to Dexter Matthews, on June 18, 1990, Division of Waste Management sends letters documenting those concerns to EPA contractor NUS and to EPA, letting them know that the neighbor's well might be bad, that Ogren had said it was contaminated and that they were having health problems, and that was contamination on the CTS site, and this was on June 18, 1990. This officially ends all plausible deniability for EPA Region 4. Pat DeRosa sent to EPA and their contractor notification about CTS of Asheville, NCD 003149556, detailing the concerns, giving them a heads up. Please find enclosed a recent telecon and a copy of a site assessment report for the subject site. I hope this will be useful to your staff in completing their site investigation. Sent by Pat DeRosa, head of the CERCLA branch Superfund section for the state of North Carolina. Ogren said that after the well was put into use, the owners began having health problems. He said the well was contaminated. So, care to guess what happened exactly a week later, on June 25th, 1990? Care to guess what happened on June 26, 1990 at 9:30 in the morning? Exactly 1 week after Pat DeRosa notified EPA and their contractor, EPA was conducting its very first sampling event, a screening site inspection phase 2, field investigation team activities at uncontrolled hazardous substances facilities, Zone 1. This is the cover from the final report, dated February 22nd, 1991. EPA was sampling exactly 1 week later. This is from the report that was shorted by 165 pages. Ultimately, we have 170 pages out of 196, still missing 26 pages. And 8 days after DeRosa's heads up to EPA and NUS, what happened 8 days later? Well, at 9:30 in the morning on June 26, EPA trespassed on the Rice property and took a sample. It was a sediment sample collected from a small stream draining the east side of the property at a depth of 0 to 2 feet. Why was it collected? Sample CASDO2 was collected to determine the extent of sediment contamination down gradient of the site. And how would it have gotten there? And just why would EPA and their contractor be going onto the Rice property without permission, without telling them that they were there, without telling them they were collecting samples, violating their Fourth Amendment that protects against illegal search and seizure? Why would they go to CASDO2 and mark that as pipes on their map? Why would they do that? 8 days earlier, Pat DeRosa told the EPA and NUS about the health problems the Rices were having, that their well was contaminated, that there was contamination at the CTS plant. Why would they trespass onto the Rice property and violate their Fourth Amendment that protects against illegal search and seizure? Why did they never tell the Rices that they were there? Why didn't they tell them that they found 1,100 parts per billion of dichloroethylene at their property? Why would they leave the Rices hanging like that? 9 years will pass. 9 years later, the state of North Carolina will sample the Rice's drinking water springs. They will be consuming 21,000 parts per billion of TCE. Now does that explain all of the things that can't be explained in the way this site was handled? Now you know that the motives included not only a $30 million subdivision on a Superfund site, but also the health impacts, the health consequences. Mrs. Rice is missing her thyroid. She had to have it removed. Mr. Rice has an inoperable brain tumor and has had 6 craniotomies. Devin Rice has 2 optical nerve tumors in her brain that are inoperable. This is the deal. There is no escaping it. This is the fate that EPA assigned us out of Region 4 because they can't afford for this information to get out, and they did their level best to prevent anyone from ever finding out. This is why you need to look at EPA-FAKE-CERCLA-Part 8.